was February 19th, 1972, and Muda Yasuko, wife of the caretaker of the Asama Sanso Lodge near Karuizawa, Nagano Prefecture, was terrified. She lay against a wall, her hands and legs tied. 5 ragged men ransacked a lodge whose upkeep she had put so much work into. They ripped up the tatami floors and upended the furniture, using every available item to barricade the doors and windows. One of the intruders had commented on the copious foodstuffs found in the lodge's pantry. It was clear they were here for the long term. 25-year-old Bando Kunio had taken on the most active role amongst the bunch. He had been relieved to find no one else in the lodge. He and the 4 others were members of Japan's violent far-left radical student group, the recently christened United Red Army. Their organization had been born in the heady and chaotic days of the late 1960s. Students were enraged by curtailments of the new democratic rights granted to Japanese citizens following World War II. They were further frustrated by Japan's tacit involvement in American-led imperialistic military action in Vietnam and other parts of the world. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese university students had taken to the streets. At first, there was mass support from the Japanese populations for these large-scale protests, but as violence rose, the police cracked down and many far-left groups were pushed underground. The Red Army faction was the URA's parent organization and the brainchild of the international revolutionary-minded Shiomi Takaya. It had made a name for itself by attacking police officers. The group also committed Japan's first airline hijacking, commandeering a Japan Airlines flight and forcing it to fly to North Korea. Notoriety led to greater police surveillance and rounds of arrest. Soon, the Red Army faction found itself left in the hands of hapless member Mori Tsuneo. A need for weapons led Mori to merge his crew with a separate group led by the sadistic Nagata Hiroko. Amongst the growing pains of their new joint group, the United Red Army, one of Mori's best and brightest, Shigenobu Fusako, left Japan to form an international terrorist wing of the Red Army in Lebanon. Back in Japan, Mori and Nagata convened a training camp for the radicals in an isolated cabin in the depths of the snowy mountains of Gunma Prefecture, a location picked partially to hide out from the police. There, amidst the heightened emotions and intensive rhetoric of self-criticism meant to inspire revolutionary zeal, something unbelievably grotesque had occurred. The gathered United Red Army members had committed a heinous and horrific purge of their own membership, torturing and killing 12 of the 29 individuals there assembled. With their comrades now buried in cold, shallow graves, the surviving core membership of the Red Army had fled the encroaching police, taking flight into the mountain passes on foot. Bando's crew included Sakaguchi Hiroshi, recently spurned husband of United Red Army leader Nagata, who had just announced her intended marital union with her co-leader Mori. One day before the two were arrested, attempting to link up with the rest of their fleeing entourage. There were also the 2 surviving Kato brothers, who had participated in the murder of their own older brother in the URA's Bloody Purge, and had split off from the rest of the fleeing URA survivors as they neared the border with Nagano Prefecture. The police had been close behind. Bando and Sakaguchi had spied officers clambering through the snow in the passes below them, and had unloaded bullets in their direction before continuing their flight. Nearing the mountain resort of Karuizawa, Bando had thought to steal a car at gunpoint, but the sight of a strange, almost fortress-like building had changed his mind. When he and his men entered the 3-storied arrow-shaped lodge and discovered only Mrs. Muta to be present, Bando's decision had been made. There could be no better spot for a last stand than a fortified building clinging to the side of a mountain which, like some medieval castle, commanded the heights. In the valley below, the police were amassing. The officers they had shot at had clearly called in reinforcements, and the revolutionaries' intrusion into the lodge had not gone unnoticed. Unknown to Bando or his crew, not only had the leaders of their movement just been arrested in Gunma, but 4 of those they had fled with had just been apprehended at a nearby train station. The stench and bedraggled appearance of the rugged radicals had caused a newspaper stand owner to connect the dots to the stories in the papers she sold. The police arrived shortly after she called them. Time was running out for the remnants of the United Red Army.
皆様、重信久子という女性をご存知でしょうか。大陸空港事件の黒幕ではないかと言われています。
Konnichiwa mina, and welcome back to Unseen Japan. I'm Noah Oskow, and today we're discussing the last desperate actions of the hunted members of the URA, and the end of the mass student movements of the New Left in Japan. This is part 3 of what is looking to be at least a 5-part series, maybe longer, and while the story of the siege of Asama Sanso is dramatic in of itself, it'll hit all the harder if you know what came before. Episode 1 is right here, and Episode 2 is here. If you find this history compelling, give us a like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss Episode 4. And maybe even consider giving us some support over at Patreon. Sadly, the content of this series means none of these episodes have been able to be properly monetized, and Patreon is what makes this channel and our mother website, unseenjapan.com, possible to begin with. We'll also be answering an interesting Patreon question in the credits about Kill Bill of all things, so stick around for that. Okay, let's get right back into the action. Sasoku hajimeo. Back at the Asama Sanso Lodge, tensions were rising. There were now well over 1,000 specialized riot police who had gathered at the scene, standing in long dark rows, the black of their helmets and flak jackets contrasting with the white snow. Armored trucks had managed to snake their way up the mountain path as well, creating a natural barrier behind which the police could take cover. Sharpshooters had been stationed on the ridges, and roadblocks had been set up to prevent any possible escape. Then there were the news crews, covering what was becoming an unbelievable story. The images they streamed into Japanese living rooms almost non-stop would go on to have great effects on Japanese society. Iconic images of the waiting riot police slurping down instant ramen is even believed to have helped popularize the food as an emergency foodstuff. Occasionally, gunfire would ring out from the lodge as the police encroached too near. The hostage's husband watched it all with mounting anxiety. He had been out showing the lodge guests around at the time when the United Red Army had chosen his hotel to make their last stand. He worried for his anemic wife and begged time and again to the police to let him switch places with her, but the radicals in the lodge never responded. The unchanging monotony of the standoff was soon shattered. Tanaka Yasuhiro, a young snack bar owner from neighboring Niigata Prefecture, had been moved by the near-constant media coverage of the ongoing hostage crisis. Inspired to action in a way that seems almost manic, he made his way to the scene where he attempted to push his way through the police line. The police, of course, would have none of this civilian interference and arrested him. But when he was released later that day, Tanaka simply decided to try a different method. Climbing the slopes north of the lodge, he ran onto the scene and managed to sprint through police barricades before they could stop him. He bore with him a bento box, perhaps hoping to open a line of communication with the radicals by ingratiating himself with them. Alas, he had seriously misread the situation. As he tried to push the box through a small opening into the building, a shot rang out, and he staggered backwards. He had been shot in the head. The injury proved fatal, and Tanaka, who had perhaps dreamed of somehow becoming a hero, instead became the first casualty of the Asama Sanso incident. On the third day of the hostage crisis, February 21st, the police were becoming anxious. Little progress had been made, and the radicals had managed to kill one manic civilian and shoot 2 police officers non-fatally. The entire Japanese public was watching, waiting for them to act. The lodge's heat and water, which had formerly been left on for the sake of the comfort of the hostage, were cut. As the interior of the lodge became more frigid and inhospitable, the parents of some of the radicals were brought in. Unknown at the time was that the child of one of these parents had already been killed in the purge. The parents, horrified by what their progeny were engaging in, used loudspeakers to implore their children to come to their senses. No response was forthcoming. On the 4th day, the police began to use force. 2 armored vehicles moved in on the lodge, and the police, crouching behind the vehicles, fired tear gas through the building's windows. The hostage takers, holding rags to their mouths, fired at the police, to cover as bullets whizzed by and ricocheted off vehicles. The police backed off, but by night they began employing a new tactic: psychological warfare. Loudspeakers blared disturbing noise, preventing sleep, recorded sounds of chainsaws, protests, sirens, and more. The sounds would persist and then suddenly stop, only to start up again once enough time had passed to allow the targets to perhaps drift to sleep. This sort of sleep torture is reportedly still being used as a Japanese police interrogation method, which may help explain the high conviction rates in the country. Later, they would employ floodlights to turn the night skies to day, as well as a baseball pitching machine that would pelt rocks at the building to keep the occupiers from getting undressed. The next morning, an attempted invasion by the brigade of policemen was foiled when untimely winds blew their smokescreen cover away. They switched out the initial plan for one in which high-powered water hoses were aimed at the living quarters of the lodge. The jets of water burst forth, smashing through windows, knocking over barricades, and inundating the rooms. Tear gas canisters followed, whose noxious fumes pushed the hijackers deeper into the recesses of the building. As night fell and the water inside the lodge froze solid, the assault of sound and noise began anew. Finally, the morning dawned on February 28th, the 10th day of the hostage situation. The loudspeakers blared a few final pleas to the radicals to lay down their arms. As always, there was no response. Ambulances had arrived at the scene in preparation for what was about to ensue. Protective sandbags had been piled high into the air, and a net had been strung in front of the building entrance to prevent the throwing of grenades from within the lodge. At last, the final order came in, and the assault commenced. As the police approached, the radicals let loose a volley of bullets. The police took cover as water jets were shot back into the building. Next came the wrecking crew. A crane was moved laboriously into position, from which it swung its wrecking ball directly at the entrance of the building, completely demolishing it. Other police leapt forward with chain and hacksaw, creating openings in the lower floors. A special police task force brought up from Tokyo entered through the newly made openings, facing no opposition on the first, ruined floor. As the Tokyo police made their way to the stairs, a shot rang out from above, though not aimed at them. One of the radicals had spotted a police superintendent in the valley below, who had been motivating his men from outside of cover. The revolutionaries had shot him squarely in the eye. The United Red Army had killed its first police officer. As the officers inside the lodge cleared the second floor and ascended to the third, another officer was shot dead as he peered around a corner. His fellows now unholstered their guns. The assault had now lasted 5 long hours. In homes across Japan, viewers sat on the edges of their seats, awestruck at the country's first ever marathon live television broadcast. By 6:26 p.m., viewerships ranked for the broadcast would reach an unheard of 89.7% of houses with televisions. The entire country stood in rapt attention. A handmade incendiary exploded near the invading police, injuring over 10 of them, although not fatally. Finally, the officers on the top floor breached the last of the barricades, managing to apprehend one of the Kato brothers. The remaining 4 radicals were buried under a pile of protective futons in the final room, still brandishing weapons. As the police approached them, Bando shot the closest officer in the eye. The man staggered over, but incredibly, he would survive. In the chaos, the other police leapt at the radicals. When the dust had settled, all 5 hostage takers were in handcuffs. The siege of Asama Sanso had ended. Mutayasko had been saved. So ended the dark saga of the United Red Army. The organization spawned by the mind of the founder of its parent organization, Shiomi Takaya, would cease to plague Japan. By the time the bodies of the 12 purged youth had been discovered at the foothills of the mountains in Gunma, popular sentiment in Japan had been turned away not only from violent activists, but also from political activism in general. The Yodogo hijacking, the purges, the siege of Asama Sanso, all shook Japan to its core. It was clear that there was to be a great deal of soul-searching in the offing. Japan's Minister of Education spoke up following the disinterment of the bodies, harshly criticizing the teachers and professors of Japan for failing their youth by creating a system in which such violence had been allowed to be fostered. Universities were no longer to be a place of radicalization. Rather, they were to take their intended form as a stepping stone to careers and life employment within the ordered system of Japanese society. In the eyes of the public, the judicial sentencing that soon followed for the radical perpetrators of these crimes befitted the evil that had occurred. Nagata, Mori, and Sakaguchi were all sentenced to death. Mori took his own life a year later, strangling himself with a bedsheet in his prison cell. The other two had trials and appeals that continued for decades and held off their final days of judgment. Nagata passed away of brain cancer while still imprisoned in 2011, 4 decades after she led her grisly purge. Her husband, Sakaguchi, remains alive. As of 2021, he is still awaiting execution. Bando Kunio, who led the 5 invaders into the Asama Sanso Lodge and who killed a policeman in the ensuing battle, was spared death but still received an extremely long jail sentence. His father, upon seeing confirmation that his son had been one of the hostage takers on TV, immediately took his own life. Despite his jail sentence, Bando's days in the revolutionary field were in fact far from over. The hostage from the siege of Asama Sanso Lodge, Mudo Yasuko returned to her daily life. Despite the national fame her captivity granted her, her picture had been broadcast innumerable times during the event, and she had broken the previous modern Japanese record for hours spent hostage many times over. She declined all requests for interviews after her initial rescuing. She claimed her captors had treated her kindly despite tying her to a bed. One had even given her an omamori, a temple charm, that he said would help keep her safe. With the vast majority of their core membership dead or imprisoned, and having lost even an ounce of public support, the United Red Army ceased to exist. With an increasingly militarized, skilled, and vigilant police force, and with no public backing, groups like the URA could no longer functionally operate in Japan. After 20 years, the mass student movement in Japan had come to a horrifying, distressing end. The youth of Japan remain apathetic to politics, and their civic engagement remains low. The shock caused by the URA is just one among many phenomena that led to these trends, but one which is hard to ignore. And yet, despite all this, the movement that began with the Red Army faction had not yet been snuffed out. In faraway Lebanon, Shigenobu Fusako was still fighting for her cause, more passionate than ever. Soon, she would have a small militia of hardened, trained revolutionaries to call her own. Escaping the chaos and self-destruction of the United Red Army in Japan, Shigenobu was about to emblazon the name of her movement across the world. She would do so by turning to terrorism of a type her revolutionary brothers and sisters back in Japan could barely imagine. For the next 2 decades, she would make the imperialist world fear the name of the Japanese Red Army. Alright everyone, thank you for watching this one all the way through. We've come to the end of an era. The end of large-scale public support for the New Left and mass student activism in Japan. This also means that as far as the Japanese Red Army story goes, the part which takes place in Japan is, for the most part, over. Yet, the entity that would continue to be called the JRA was far, far from finished. So, on to our patron question. Nob asks, in the movie Kill Bill, when the bride meets with Hanzo in the bar, he compliments her Japanese, exclaiming, "You speak Japanese like we speak Japanese." Does Uma Thurman actually speak Japanese well in this scene? Interesting question, Nob. So within the context of this scene, Uma Thurman is purposely acting like a fresh-off-the-plane tourist.
What other words did you learn?
Oh, let's see, arigato?
Arigato. Good.
Konnichiwa.
Perfect. Good, good, good. You say Japanese word like you Japanese.
Mything her Japanese pronunciation so that Hattori Hanzo won't put up his guard. Later, however, she drops the act, speaking Japanese in an almost poetic way.
日本刀が必要で。
一体日本刀を何に使うんですか?
切りたいネズミがいるから。
As for the character's diegetically fluent Japanese, well, I asked an actual Japanese person, Kawakami Yui, what she thinks.
これって意外とよく見るシチュエーションだと思うんだよね。外国人が一言ありがとうって言っただけでもやっぱり日本人は嬉しいからすっごく褒める。でも服部半蔵の名前を出した後の彼女の日本語はもちろん完璧とは言えないけど断然自然で滑らかだったからこれこそ褒めるべきだよね。
So there you have it. If you'd like to ask us a question, join up with our Patreon. Your support means the world to us and allows Unseen Japan to be what it is. I'll see you back here next time as we venture far from Japan and to the distant lands of the Middle East. Until then, be well and mata. One of the radicals had stopped a police superintendent. One of the radicals had spotted a police superintendent.
Hi, Lisa. Hi,
Superintendent
Chalmers.
Good Lord!